So we're back to the beginning, starting the Torah fresh and new. And I heard a very interesting comment by a speaker recently who said that when you restart the Torah at Bereisheet, it's a great opportunity to evaluate how much you've grown over the Chagim, over the holidays, over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, because it would demonstrate like some enhanced receptivity to the ideas of the Torah. Because after all, that, in a certain sense, that's a concept of growth. As a person grows through personal limitations, so they become bigger as people and their scope and view becomes bigger. So I'll leave it up for you to determine whether this year's Torah classes will have some additional scope and excitement compared to others. What I wanted to do this week is Parshat Noach, but I wanted to really spend at least 2 sessions and maybe a couple of more on the beginning of the Torah. And the idea being, we have a unique sense of what creation is all about. And I want to say this up front. The first Rashi in the classical commentary on the Torah questions why we even begin with Genesis altogether. And it's not because Rashi is challenging God, but because Rashi says, why not begin with mitzvot? Because mitzvot are what we practice and the way we express a fulfillment of the Torah. And therefore, do we really need this preamble? And Rashi gives an answer which takes some time to understand, and we've discussed it in the past. But in any event, and we're going to see this from comments of Rashi that we're going to look at tonight, Rashi's always focused on how we can grow and what we can learn from Torah. Not an esoteric idea, the way Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, the 19th century German commentator puts it, is that the Jewish Bible is not a book about God. It's a book about mankind and seeing mankind through God's eyes. So that's the track we're going to take. And we're going to begin, if you have a stone chumash or if you have any copy of the Torah, you're welcome to use it. We're going to begin in chapter 2, sentence 8, the very famous quote, which is, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And in Hebrew, and this is the correct, accurate translation, Na'aseh Adam, we will make man. And that provokes the very famous question, who's the we, Kimosabi? Because after all, the most fundamental tenet of the Torah, according to Nachmanides, is that Bereisheet bara Elokim, that God initiates all reality. God alone. When we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, God is one. We're very big on the idea, as we say in the Song of Yigdal, there was nothing prior to God's existence, which transcends time and always was, and there will be nothing after God's existence, so to speak, because God's existence also transcends any limitation. So it's a fundamental idea that God is the creator. And the Ramban says, in fact, that's his opinion, different than Rashi, of why the Torah begins at the place it begins, because the Ramban Nachmanides asserts that God began creation with absolute no limitations. Now, it's unlike if I was an artist and I showed you a painting, you said, that's a beautiful painting, I wish you would have had more colors to use and utilize, or I wish you would have had a larger canvas, or I wish you would have used a different medium instead of the medium you used. All those would speak to limitations which limited the creative process of making this painting into a reality. And the Ramban asserts over and over again, God acts with no limitation. The world that you and I live in, the air that we breathe, the spouse that we may be married to, the children that we have, they're all perfect in the sense that the limitations are not imposed limitations, but they originate in God's selective choice in terms of what God wanted to create. So we're faced with a dilemma. Now, Rav Sadia Gaon, you should know in the classical sense, answers this idea, let us make man, says very simply, this is the royal we, and it's referring only to God. And the reason that it's written as Na'aseh Adam, let us make man, is to impress upon us human beings the royalty of God, the dominion of God, the greatness of God, just like a king would speak to his subjects, lahabdil, on a human level, and just like a general, might come in and say, or a coach on the sideline of a football game says, we are going to run the ball. We've decided to run the ball. No, I'm making the decision. I have the authority here. This is my team, and I'm directing you what to do. So Sadia Gaon answers very simply, that's what the royal we is. Rashi takes a different track and says no. And Rashi draws this from a medrash. Again, Rashi doesn't just make up what he writes. Rashi says, God consulted with the angels. So there really is a we. And Rashi explains that this is to teach derech eretz, to teach a person the proper way of operating, which is you consult with others, even though a decision might be up to you, and even though you may have great confidence in your decision-making ability, it's still proper for a human being to consult with those people around him. And one nuance in the Medrash that I never saw before is it says that after all, the angels were very lofty beings, and God didn't want them to feel as though they could become jealous of man and wonder, why did you make man like this or like that or the other thing? So in a certain sense, God presented the idea up in the heavens. And God said, this is man, my vision for mankind. I'm going to create man. What do you think? And the Medrash says there was a debate that went on. Truth said you can't create man because man can't ultimately perceive truth, and man tells lies. Peace also spoke against the creation of mankind because there's always strife when there are people, there's always differences of opinion. Chesed, the midah, the attribute of kindness, the divine angel, so to speak, on that side, said, oh, but man's going to do some kindness along the way, and it'll be beautiful and great to behold, and of course you should create man. So my understanding until recently was as follows, that God, in order to teach us how to conduct our lives properly, so God consulted with the angels all put in their input, and God said, okay, we're creating man. And that itself is a tremendous insight into our Torah, because again, the Torah is not giving us secret knowledge that we should have insight over others. The Torah is telling us, here's a way to live your life. There are people around you, consult with them, act in accord with them, give thought to what they have to say. And then if you're the responsible person, you'll make the decision, but do it in a way that doesn't arouse jealousy, doesn't arouse anger. Do it in the most peaceful, organized way possible. And that's a beautiful lesson. And of course, Rashi alludes to the fact that there's a great risk in writing the Torah this way, because as is pointed out, if I want to be a wise guy, or if I want to be an apikoros, I'll say, there are many gods. I don't know where the Jews get this idea of one God. If you look in the Jewish Bible, it said, let us make man. So if God was really one God, what is this stuff about let us make man in the plural? And in a certain sense, the Torah is opening the door or opening the possibility to a heretic quoting the scripture. But we know about that. Daniel Webster already told us that the devil cites the scriptures. So, but Rashi says that's not a small matter, but it's clear that the need to teach us human beings derech eretz, propriety, ways of acting, ways of behaving that will be conducive to building up the world and fulfilling the goals God has for humanity, they have to be taught. That's the primary purpose of the Torah, and don't ever forget it. We learn humility, we learn collaboration, we learn to recognize our own limitations. And it's almost analogous to what we're going to see later on in chapter 2, sentence 18 on page 12 in the Stone Chumash, where God reflects and says it's not good for man to be alone. Most of us have probably thought it sometimes in our lives it wouldn't be such a bad idea to be alone. But the fact of the matter is that Rashi again highlights something here. And what Rashi highlights is that if man lived as a singular being, man would feel as though, well, there's two gods in a sense. There's a God upstairs who runs the upper world. He's one God. And there's me, I'm the God down here. And we all know, we've all certainly encountered people who sort of have that impression of themselves that if only I ruled the world, I know better than everybody else how the world should run. And that's part of the equation of creating a unity of a family of husband and wife, of an Ezer, Kenegdo, a helpmate, opposite a person, two people having to fashion a life together, having to collaborate to bring life into the world. All that's included in those ideas. But the insight that I didn't consider before is a perspective on this medrash, which goes as follows, that in the heavenly spheres, God proposed this idea, let's create man. And a tremendous debate ensued. And all the witnesses were lining up and the court was packed and people were yelling and screaming in an orderly way and presenting their viewpoints with passion, which obviously creates a picture that creating man was not such a simple thing, which I think we're commended to when people look at the second Torah portion that we're going to read this week, and they think about God regretting creating man, so to speak. God sees from the get-go, and so do all the angels and heavenly beings, that this is an edgy thing to do. Creating a morally free being who can choose and who's empowered to either uplift the world or drag the world down. It's a high-risk proposition for God to turn over the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, to such an extent. But this view of the Medrash is in the midst of the debate, while people were presenting their views and while it was certainly undecided or far from decided whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, God, so to speak, banged the gavel and said, let us create man. Enough discussion, enough debate. Many of these questions will never be resolved. We're going forward. This creation is going to happen. I'm going to turn the keys to the kingdom over to human beings, and we're going to minister. You, the angels, are going to minister to them, and we're going to offer guidance and instruction and direction and support, and we'll see where it takes us, whether the world is uplifted and fulfills a lofty purpose, or whether the world descends to a sense of anarchy and brutishness and power and abuse of one another. It's in their hands. And yes, there's different attributes that come to play: truth and dishonesty and peace and strife and kindness and lacking compassion. All these things are part of the mix. Let us create man. The show is starting. The world is now going to come to fruition with this creation, and we're going to see how the purposefulness with which all of this was created is going to play itself out. So God, in a certain sense, according to one explanation, God said, it's not going to be a vote here. It's not going to be, I give more weight to this opinion or to that opinion. Everyone is correct here. We're going to forge ahead. We're going to create life. We're going to let human history unfold, not without guidance and not without supervision and not without direction, but we're going to let it rip. And Na'aseh Adam is a brave, forward statement, which in that sense is very inspiring to us as well, not only for the humility it could teach us, but even for the lesson in terms of not wallowing in uncertainty and realizing that life has to take its course and that that's also part of God's plan. The parts that are congruent with God's thinking have to run their course, and the aspects that are not congruent with God's thinking also have to run their course. And that, I think, is a big lesson for us to hold on to. Now, another medrash, a very perplexing one, and this is discussed by Rabbi Shlomo Yonason Harris in a Devar Torah that he gave. But let's go back to the very beginning of the Torah. This is a very strange and interesting medrash. The medrash quotes a Rabbi Avohu. Rabbi Avohu is one of the Talmudic sages. And Rabbi Avohu says that the famous words, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, and God said, let there be light. That was God envisioning from the outset of creation, even before mankind was created, a vision of, well, let me envision the greatness of human beings. Let there be light. In other words, let's see what a bright, robust world looks like. And so in a certain sense, in God's thinking, what played out was beautiful pictures of parents taking care of children, compassion, kindness, being slow to anger, people standing up for one another, people helping the poor and the disadvantaged, all the beauty that we have imagined or we've read about or we've seen, or even the great moments of literature. That was all included when God says, let there be light. And then there was a flip side, because before God said that, it said, V'aretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tehom. In sentence 2, the earth was astonishingly empty with darkness upon the surface of the deep. There was a vision at the very outset of creation of the dark moments of the world, of the horrors of the world, of the brutality and selfishness that could unfold in the world. And now the Medrash says something very surprising. The Medrash says that, so both of these things were foreseen. And Rabbi Avoh comes along and says, so which one did God favor? He says that's answered at the end when God said he called the L'or Yom. I'm sorry, when God says he contemplated the light, Vayar Elokim et ha'or ki tov. Astonishingly, Rabbi Avoh says, in this scenario, I would have been left hanging. Was the dark picture what appealed to God? Or was it the light, the picture of light that appealed to God? And the Torah resolves that in the next sentence of the Torah, when it says in sentence 4, God contemplated the light and he said it was good. God had a preference for the light. So you wonder what's going on here. What is this Medrash even beginning to refer to? And here Rabbi Harris brings down an interesting insight or commentary from the Kitav Sofer, a Hungarian rabbinic leader from the early 1800s. And he says as follows: Rabbi Avoh is raising an issue that if you look through human history, is it an evil person doing good that is most cherished by God? Or is it a good, righteous person doing good that is most cherished by God? There is the darkness is looking at the course of evil in the world, but even if you follow the course of evil, you're going to see sparks of goodness. And so according to this fanciful reading, this allegorical reading that Rabbi Avoh introduces in this Medrash, God, at the outset of creation, was envisioning a world in which it is a mixed bag. There'll be moments when evil people do good, and maybe that should be the reason for the world. After all, it's a bigger challenge for an evil person to do something good than it is for a good person to do something good, right? I think we could agree on that. So therefore, that's the question, according to Rabbi Avo, in an allegorical sense, that the Torah was raising when you take this vein of understanding these initial sentences of the Torah. And then what's the answer? So Rabbi Avo says, when it says that God said, he contemplated the light and it was good. God said, you have to contemplate goodness, because goodness is not just a mechanical action, but goodness also has to be reflective of what's inside the person and the depth of intention and focus and purpose that the person brings to the goodness they're doing. So here, this medrash, this oblique medrash, which seems to very strangely being addressing these sentences in the Torah, is pointing us in the direction of saying, if you want to just look at actions in isolation and not think about human development and the grandeur of a person refining themselves from the inside out, but you want to look at the world mechanically, which is unfortunately how many people do, and even religious people, very religious people, seem to reduce the world down to mechanical actions. You know, I did this mitzvah, I did this mitzvah, I did this mitzvah. You might hear people say, and in the meantime, they're living a very harsh life, a very unkind life, a very insensitive life. We know that such things do happen in the world, but they could say, look, from God's perspective, look at me, look, I'm doing mitzvahs, you know. And then if you want to get into a very mechanical, computational sense of the world, you'll say, okay, so this person did 14 negative things and 14 good things, or maybe 14 negative things and 8 good things. But after all, the relief of the darkness versus the light makes those 8 good things really stand out. Rabbi Avo says that's a misunderstanding of God's vision for creation. It's a misunderstanding of God's perception of light. God is not working and looking and creating on the mechanical, superficial level, but rather God is looking into the heart of a person. And obviously, when a righteous person who accustoms oneself to be kind, to be patient, to be caring, to be generous, as such a person lives their life, and as those feelings grow within them, in some ways it becomes easier for them to continue being nice because they've developed those inner attributes within themselves. And by the same token, the cruel person who all of a sudden is smitten by a sense of compassion and does something with great kindness or great goodness, you could say, wow, even a bum like that can go out of his way to give honor to a needy person and make sure that they're okay. That's not what life is about. And that's what this medrash is. It adds something very inspiring and very beautiful. And it gives us an insight in terms of the way it's put by the Talmud is Rachmana Riba Boy. God really desires the heart. God, yes, we have mitzvot, and those mitzvot involve actions, and we know we can spoof it if we want, you know. Well, you know, a drop of milk fell in here, so let's measure, is there 59 portions of meat to 1 portion of milk, then we're not allowed to eat it. And if it's 60 to 1, then I am allowed to eat it. And all these type of calculations and minutia, and sometimes you hear people describe them as being caught up in the weeds and not seeing the beauty of the forest. No one, Rebbe Avo says from the outset, should think that that's where it's at. Where it's really meant to be at as a human being, embracing the will of Hashem and the mitzvot of Hashem and the lessons that the Torah teaches us in such a way that they will grow and grow. And yes, goodness should become second nature to them. And of course, there'll always be some moral challenges, but that goodness should grow and grow. The level of sincerity should grow, the depth of commitment, the depth of compassion, the depth of empathy, all these attitudes should grow deeply within the person. And that's really where the action is at. That's where the world really takes on meaning and purpose. So this is the inside of this matter. So I think this is a very lofty thing, and it's, it's what our intention is, what our purity of heart is, what we bring to the table in all the good that we do. So when God contemplated creation, God saw all the actions and all of the outcomes and all the moments of history and all the newsreels. But God was looking beyond that, and God was measuring and looking into the hearts of the people. And this leads us to an insight which is very much, if we look back to Rosh Hashanah, to the high holidays, it becomes very eye-opening. Because you may be familiar with the example Maimonides. Maimonides, when he writes about Rosh Hashanah, and it's quoted widely, Maimonides said a person should imagine themselves that the scale of justice is exactly balanced, 50-50. And on Rosh Hashanah, you should contemplate the idea, if the scale of justice is exactly balanced, all we have to do is one good deed, and that tips the scale. Now, this is a fanciful notion, because in the hurly-burly of life, it's hard to imagine it being very common for people to be considered in the middle, a Benoni, as the Maimonides describes them, an average person, and that they're going through life and things are exactly 50-50, so that if I smile at someone who's feeling down, the scales are this way and I've saved the world. And if I act grumpy or angrily to somebody, the scales tip the other way and everything should be destroyed. So Rabbi Tatz presents this idea in a very different way. And he says like this, he says, according to what he explains, Maimonides says, this analogy of a tree planted in the earth. A tree grows in many different directions. It grows in directions that are good, it grows in directions that are not so good. It can have fruit that are bitter, it can have fruit that's sweet, all coming from the same tree. And he says, this is a human being, we're a mixed bag. The question is, do we want to uproot the tree and move it in a directionality which is going to make more of the fruit sweet and more of the person sincere, and is going to tip the scales, not in the sense of putting a feather on one part of a perfectly balanced scientific scale, and even a feather can add that, it's that sensitive that it creates such a difference in weight. It's more of a question of the directionality of a person's life, that a person should contemplate themselves, yes, at whatever age I am at this moment, I've achieved a certain amount, I've developed myself, but wherever I am right now, let me calculate that as being in the middle. And let me think hard on these high holidays that have just passed, or even on any day of the year. What does it take? They have the phrase, move the needle, but to move the directionality, the trunk. And he plays this out, he says, after all, those particulars, those minutiae, which may be bitter fruit, those things can be pruned away. And that's the normal course of life, where people face certain challenges, suffering, illnesses. Those are pruning a tree so that only the best fruit remains, so that only the strongest branches are there, so that only that which gives the most shade and the most benefit to mankind remains. That's a detailed process of living one's life. But on Rosh Hashanah, when we look at the big picture is, what direction are we moving in? Can we pick up the roots and the trunk and the whole being that we are, and can we move it to a place that's a little bit more secure, a little bit more sweet, a little bit more kind? That's the analogy that he uses. And you see how that fits in so strongly with the insight of God's commitment to teach us to be humble, to be self-effacing, to be thoughtful of others, and what God really cherishes in the world. And I just want to use as a reference for this, it's a little bit of a stretch, but if you look on page 82 in the Stone Chumash, and that's Genesis chapter 18, sentence 19, and here we're really jumping ahead a few portions of the Torah. God makes an audacious statement about Abraham. And God says, I love him. It's on page 83 in the Stone Chumash. Why? Because he commands his children and his household after him that they keep the way of Hashem, doing charity and justice. Now, where does this come from? Where does this expression of God loving a particular individual? What's he loving him for? And I just want to suggest something which I think for each of us who are parents becomes so clear and so apparent. If we're capable of impacting our children, and if we're capable of, use the word command, but to directing them and elevating them and having that kind of impact on our households and within our sphere of influence, that's a sign that the goodness that we're preaching or that we're committed to is really rooted within us in a deep way. Because people ultimately hear what comes from your heart rather than what comes from your mouth. And what words you use become far less important than the way you live your life and the sense a person has of, I want to be a growing, developing person. And for a person to be able to inspire others, and that's the aspect that God is focusing in on here, that becomes a sign of what's going on deep within the person. And I just want to conclude with the sentence from Nehemiah. It's a sentence that we quote in the Siddur, that we say is part of the morning service every day. But it describes God as creating everything. God fashioned the sun and the moon and the stars and the universe and the multiverse and whatever you want to call it. And through it all, he focused on one man, which we'll read about in another couple of weeks, Avraham. Why? Umatzata et levavo ne'amon lefanecha. Because God found his heart to be faithful, to be true, to be straight. And we know that this relationship, this intense relationship between Abraham and God, and included Sarah, his wife, as well, his whole household here, even though at this point he only had one child, which was Ishmael, and Isaac was not yet born. But this focus on the depths of the soul and the heart of a person, and that's what's precious to God, and that when God envisioned, created mankind, God said, yeah, there's going to be a tremendous amount of horror that's going to take place. And there'll be a tremendous amount of good that takes place. And some of that good will come from the righteous people, and some of that good will even come from the not righteous people. But God's focus and what God cherishes and what he's looking for and what he seeks to develop are people like an Abraham who could spend 99 years of their life working towards an approachment to God, so that in the 99th year they could receive the mitzvah of circumcision and go on and bring a child into the world like an Isaac. What I wanted to highlight here is the thought. It's quoted often, mitoch shelo lishma bo lishma. Whenever we do good, we're not going to have this level of purity. It takes a lifetime to develop it. So we could be daunted by that. So I don't mean to throw cold water in anybody's face. And I don't want anybody, God forbid, to walk away from this class and say, gee, maybe I'm not such a righteous person, so even the good that I do isn't really valuable. That's totally not the point here. Because the path to human perfection involves walking through a lot of mud, and it involves a lot of missteps. And that's where we get this assurance, no matter what your intention is, if you pursue goodness, Baal Ishma, it will ultimately become more and more reflective of who you really are as a person. And there's a quote in the Talmud that I just recently encountered for the first time. Talmudic sage Rav Sheshet, he was diligently studying Torah to promote his growth. And it says every 30 days, tonight's Rosh Chodesh, so it would probably be on a night like this, he would sit at home, lean against the door, and he would rejoice because he studied Torah and he felt as though he grew from it. And he's challenged by Rebbe Eliezer and says, how do you do that? Is Torah just for you? Don't we believe that Torah can elevate the whole world? Aren't you doing something that's smug and selfish? He did it privately. He wasn't boasting or anything like that. Isn't your scope short when you're just trying to focus on your own personal growth without putting it into the context of influencing the world? And the Gemara says, well, at the outset, a person needs to first develop themselves. Like Hill says, if I'm not going to be for myself, who will be for me? I need to begin doing good, even though I may lack conviction, even though it may be hard for me, even though it may be not the norm of my behavior, but I'm doing so ultimately so that I can grow and develop and influence myself so that eventually I can become the type of person who can influence the world. And that's really what I believe this year strikes me as the most fundamental lesson and the best starting point for each of us to have as we restart our learning of the Torah, and to cling to that idea that, yes, I'm going to act in a way which brings out reflects in my actions that I'm created in the image of God. And slowly but surely over time, I'm going to look to ever deepen that. My scope is going to become broader. It's going to become more inclusive. And I'm going to become the kind of person that God envisioned at the outset of the world as being truly a source of light that comes from deep within and that shines very bright on the outside as well. And please God, we should be blessed this year that our Torah study should have that impact on us as we go forward. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Okay, just want to thank everybody for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a good night.